Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
And welcome to your weekend show. I am your host, Bob Biermann. So glad you're taking time from your busy schedule to spend it with me. You know, I'm having a difficult time believing that this is the first weekend in February. The month of January is now behind us, and what a month it has been. We have gone through so much in a short amount of time. And the big question is, where did the time go? Time is a precious commodity. And I remember my grandparents and my parents telling me as a young kid, as you get older, time seems to move so much faster. And when I was young, it never really, I couldn't comprehend that. I didn't understand it. If you're over 40, over 50, like me, over 60 now, you are beginning to, or now do, understand the concept of time and how precious it becomes. You know, I guess maybe it's because when you're younger, you don't have that many years behind you, so everything looking years ahead seems so far down the road, you'll never get there. Think about it when you're in the first grade. You're like 5 years old. And thinking in terms of graduating high school, that's 12 years away. And that seems like an eternity, like you'll never get 12 years down the road. Good grief. Even when I got to the 8th grade and finally finished and started high school, I'm thinking 4 years is such an incredibly long time. It'll drag on for centuries. That's how it felt when I started high school. But then again, you're doing it from the perspective of somebody that's only like, 14, 15 years old or less. In my case, I guess I was 13 when I started high school. And the idea of getting out when I was 17, it seems so far down the road. Waiting until you're 16 to get a driver's license where I lived in the state of New York, your first permit. I thought those 2 years would never go by. I was thinking the other day how time really does fly. There are times that I do this radio show and it feels like I just started doing it for the first time, maybe a month or 2 or 3 ago. Not what it really is. 4 years have gone by since we first put this radio program together. It was in February of 2015. I began to put together the first demo program for your weekend show together. And I wondered if it would be something that would sustain, something that would be around for a while. It was hard to tell when I first started. There was really no way to know when we first began your weekend show. And now 4 years have gone by. The equivalent amount of time, I want you to think about this for a second, the equivalent amount of time that it took me to get through high school or for college. Yet high school seemed to drag on for an eternity, and I'm realizing that one day next month in March, and I'll look up the exact date, was the airing of the first Your Weekend show 4 years ago. Where in the world did 4 years go? I'm thinking in terms of where has 10 years gone, 15 years gone, 20 years gone, 20 plus years gone. This is 2019. And it was in 1999 that I'd already been not quite a year, at this point probably about 6 months, 20 years ago, living in Southwest Florida, the other coast from where I'm living now. And I was the pastor of a small mission church that had been struggling for years, and just for whatever reason, well, I know what the reason is now, but for whatever reason, it was never growing like it should grow. And I started my time there over 20 years ago. And there's some days that I wake up and I think that it was just yesterday or last year, maybe a couple of years ago, but it's been 20 years. Where has the 20 years gone? Time is one of those very precious commodities that I think all too often we take for granted in our day-to-day life. I can remember times now, looking back in my life at a younger time, especially when you're newlywed and starting out. This is going back to the 1970s and early 1980s, those first, years in a career where you're trying to work your way up the ladder, and you're in what the bankers call the acquiring phase, getting that house, getting that car, buying furniture, taking care of your responsibilities. Oftentimes, it's not hard. But sometimes it is very hard. I can remember understanding the meaning of there is more month than money, and how if you're not careful with your income, you run out before the month runs out in your next paycheck. Now, most of my first jobs, which was pretty standard back in the 1970s, paid you once a week. And I'll tell you, there are times that trying to get from Wednesday to Friday was a struggle. Making sure you had enough gas in the car, food in the house, and any of the necessities covered as you're trying to, make sure the mortgage or rent, depending on the circumstances, was paid. The utilities were paid, which back then were rather simple. We didn't have, when I first got married, we didn't have cable TV, thankfully. We just had an outside antenna. So we just worried about an electric bill and a gas bill for the house, the actual mortgage payment, and a telephone bill. And with that, we got by. It's funny, now we've added internet and cell phone and a whole heap of other things that we consider necessities in our life. But this is what I was trying to get to. Back in those days, you couldn't wait for a certain day to get here. It may be Tuesday and you're waiting for a special event on Friday, and you kind of blow off the days in between as irrelevant, unimportant. You can't wait for something because you're going through something you don't care about that much, day-to-day work, whatever the case may be. Funny, as you get older, you wish you had those wasted days back. Those days you blew off. Those days you never really did much with except go through the motions. You wish you could get them back. But time is a commodity like no other. Once it is spent, it is gone and never can be recovered. The moments I spent about 9 minutes ago at the beginning of this broadcast, they're gone. They're never coming back. I can play them back, but I can't go back. Yeah, we're talking about time today, and this is your weekend show, and I am your host, Bob Biermann. I'm so glad you're taking time to be with me. These last couple of weeks, we've had some, I think, interesting programs. I hope you thought as well. We talked a couple of weeks ago with Jeff White, who is the general manager of WRMI, which airs your weekend show worldwide on a number of different frequencies over the weekend, beginning Friday night all the way into the wee hours of Monday morning, if memory serves me correct, depending upon where in the world you live. Also, we're on the Voice of Hope in Zambia, Africa, in Lusaka in Zambia, and heard all across that continent into the Middle East and Europe. And we're heard online, not just from the website, but also from Spreaker. We're also heard on SoundCloud. And we are heard on Rackman Christian Radio. We've been there, I think, since early on with this program. It started, too, being on Rackman Christian Radio way back in 2015. And we're thankful for each and every one of you that take the time to listen to your weekend show each and every week. And I'm even more thankful for those of you that can take the time to write the program and share your thoughts and ideas and where you're listening. It always means a lot to me. We are currently working, as you've noticed, if you've been to the website in the past, 2 weeks or less, you will notice that there have been some substantial changes to the website, and I can assure you a lot more coming. We're moving first to a different platform, and then we're going to be adding some additional content and changing the way you access other content like prior programs in particular. So those are things that we're working on right now, and we hope that you will avail yourself of the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. And we maintain a Facebook presence as well. You can just go to Facebook and just type in Your Weekend Show in a search. And I've learned if you make it all one word, bing, it comes right up. That's Your Weekend Show on Facebook and even Twitter from time to time. I'd love to hear from you this week, how you're listening and where you are listening. And most important, I would love to hear from you some ideas for some topics that we could pursue together on this program. Would you consider getting in touch with me at Your Weekend Show? I also shared a mailing address that you can use. I know there are a few people that have asked in the past because they don't really do internet, and I know there are a lot of people that don't, and I understand some of the reasons, and that's fine. I don't think. Well, we'll get into this in a few minutes, but the mailing address for those who would rather write. We will use for this literally our Georgia address, where we spend part of our year, kind of our sanctuary and a place that I do a lot of reading and work and prep work in other things that I'm involved with. And that is 21 Berkshire Lane, 21 Berkshire, that's one word, Berkshire, 21 Berkshire Lane, and you need to add this number 263. We're a small little city, and they have a common mailbox system, so it is 21 Berkshire Lane, number 263, in Sky Valley. That's two words, Sky Valley, in the state of Georgia, and the zip code is 30537. Once again, that is 21 Berkshire Lane, number 263, Sky Valley, Georgia, 30537. Just put on the letter, if you're addressing it to me, just put down Bob at Your Weekend Show or Bob Biermann. Guess what? It'll get to me. And even though I'm in Florida for a while, it'll be forwarded to where we are during this time of the year. So I didn't want to have two confusing addresses. It's just a lot easier to use the one. And with the post office being so small and friendly in Georgia, if I have a problem, I know who to pick up the phone, even from when we're down here, and make a call. It makes for a totally different world. This is Your Weekend Show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. Today, we're talking about time.
I'm 15 for a moment, caught in between 10 and 20, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are. feels better than ever, and we're on fire, making our way back from Mars. 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to lose. 15, there's never a wish better than this, when you only got 100 years to live. I'm 33 for a moment, I'm still the man, but you see I'm there, a kid on the way, babe, a family on my mind. I'm 45 for a moment, the sea is high and I'm heading through war crosses, chasing the years of my life. 15, there's still time for you, time to buy and time to lose yourself within a morning star. 15, I'm alright with you. 15, there's never a wish better than this, when you only got 100 years to live. Half time goes by, suddenly you're wise, another blink of an eye. 67 is gone, the sun is getting high, we're moving on. I'm 99 for a moment, I'm dying for just another moment, and I'm just dreaming, counting the ways to where you are. 15, there's still time for you. 22, I feel her too. 33, you're on your way. Every day's a new day. Got 100 years to live.
Vladimir John Ondrasik III, known by his stage name 5 for Fighting, and the song 100 Years. Starts out 15 years of age. And as I'm listening to this song, it's suddenly dawning on me that this song is 15 years old. It came out actually in November of 2003. And when I was thinking about using the song for this segment, I didn't realize how old it was until I had finished the first segment and looked while it was playing what year it came out. 15 plus years have gone by since that song was released. What an amazing thing time is, and it's funny, as the old Willie Nelson song used to say, it's funny how time slips away, and oftentimes it truly does. We're talking about time today and how we can best use the time that we have. You know, I look back over my life, and maybe you've done the same thing, and you can identify. Maybe you haven't quite hit this point yet, but inevitably we all do. There's a thing that is commonly called, and I'm not sure if I quite agree with the precept, called the midlife crisis. They say it's supposed to happen to men. Well, if it did, the only thing I did during that period of time was a slight career change, but answering a call that was on my life from years before when I turned a little after my 40th birthday. But that's a little bit different than some of these midlife crises we're told we're supposed to have, where husbands and wives get divorced for all the wrong reasons. They get bored. They want something different in life. And I'm not certain if that is really something you want to consider doing. I can remember when I was in my late 30s. By that point, I'd been married about 18, 19 years. Hadn't even celebrated yet our 20th anniversary. And I realized at that point what a wonderful person that I was married to, and what a blessing she was to me in my life. And let me tell you just a little bit about my wife at the time. I met her in the big state of Georgia in February of 1975. I met her at a drugstore called Pruitt's Drugstore in beautiful downtown Toccoa, Georgia. It was my first day ever in that community. I'd never been there before in my life, and I was in the process of applying for a job at a radio station in that town. And I had done my first interview that morning. I was told to go find some lunch, and if I could come back that afternoon and spend some time, and how late could I stay, and I told him I was totally flexible. And I remember going to this little drugstore in downtown Toccoa, Georgia, that had a luncheonette counter. It's the first thing I kind of found. I didn't yet know my way around. And as I checked out, there was this very pretty gal at the cash register that just caught my eye. And, I'm about 20 years of age, closing in on 21. And for some reason, this gal just really captured me in a way that almost surprised me at the time. And I struck up a little conversation. You can do that in a small Georgia town, especially back then. And she recognized the fact that I wasn't from around here. I didn't have that Georgia accent. Had a little bit of a New York accent buried in there, not too strong. And told her that I was applying for a job at radio station WLET there in Toccoa, Georgia. And I was supposed to go back and continue that interview this afternoon. And she said, well, let me know if you get that job. Now, maybe that was just conversation, but she did ask, let me know if you get the job. Well, I went back to the radio station, and I was hired and actually started on the air that afternoon on WLET. And so the next day, now that I knew where this luncheonette counter was, they also served breakfast. The next day, I needed to be back there in Georgia. I started a little bit of training for a day or two. I think it was like a Wednesday or a Thursday when I came to Toccoa, and I needed to spend one more day learning how their studio worked before I was going to be let on my own the next week on a Monday, working on the air with the guy that had the shift that was leaving for other opportunities. Kind of a rare thing where a radio announcer turns in his notice and they let him work on to the end of his notice. But he did. It was a small town. Everybody knew everybody. And so I came back to Toccoa the next day. I was staying over in South Carolina, about 45 minutes, less than an hour away when I first started that job before I moved to Toccoa. And I decided to stop by that luncheonette counter and see if that young gal, that pretty gal that I had seen the day before that captured my imagination, was still there. And she was. And so I came in, and she recognized me from the day before and asked, how did it go? I said, well, I start really this coming Monday. I'm in there for some training today, but I'm the new afternoon radio announcer at the radio station WLET, and the rest is kind of history. Well, over the next several weeks, I kept coming back to that drugstore and coming back to that luncheonette counter, and eventually got the courage to ask a little bit more about her. She was a little bit older than I was. She'd been married before, long story, had 2 daughters at home, and she was scared of that age difference that we had. She really was. Even though she always consistently looked younger than I did all throughout our time together, she always did look younger. She finally reluctantly agreed to go out on a date to McDonald's. Not exactly what you'd call the most high-class place to have a first date, but we did. And then after that, we had dinner together at her house. I met her daughters, and she was so resistant because of the age, but she really liked me and fell in love with me, and I did with her. And in August of that same year, we met in February. August of that same year, we got married. We eloped. Ran off to see a pastor friend of mine, and then we ran off to the big city of Clemson, South Carolina, to spend our honeymoon, and then on to Anderson, where my mother and grandparents lived at the time. And so that's when they met her for the first time, because, like I say, we eloped. How fast the time went by. We started out in our married life in Toccoa, and I had the goal, and I've shared this before on the radio program, of rising up in the radio business. It's what I wanted to do ever since I was in high school. I wanted to be that big nighttime radio announcer on some high-powered blowtorch radio station covering half of the United States out of a city like New York or Chicago or Cleveland or Detroit or wherever. That's what I wanted to do. And working my way up the food chain, as they call it, would be a town like a Toccoa, Georgia, on the way to a Gainesville, Georgia, maybe a Greenville, South Carolina, or Atlanta, and from there to bigger and better markets. And surprisingly, this woman I married was fine with that and signed on, and we moved a lot in those early years of my career. We moved a lot by necessity, because that's just the way that it was in the radio business in the 1970s. But I also thankfully had an interest in engineering and pursued that and added that as one of my primary functions in the radio business over time. And I'm glad that I did, because, you know, being a radio announcer was very stressful on our marriage because of the hours, the travel, the constant concern, you know, when the rating books come out, would the ratings be good enough? Would they keep you? Would they fire you or hire somebody else? And, you know, that's not the way to live. And it's not a good and efficient and proper way to use your time. And I found that the engineering side offered a lot more stability. The income was not bad. And you didn't worry about would you have a job at the next rating book. And if you're in a bigger market, they were like every 3 months, some markets every 6 months. And that's not the way to live, wondering if the next 90 days could end your career at that radio station, then what? Way back then, there was a TV show on the air that kind of summed it up. It was called WKRP in Cincinnati. And the idea of being up and down the dial. There's also a very morbid and very depressing song by Harry Chapin that really described the broadcast industry for so many people at that time. And I was seeing it. A lot of burnout. You know, radio back in the late 30s and 40s and 50s was radio drama and programs. And most local radio stations had a handful of announcers that did the commercials and operated the equipment, but much of the programming came from the NBC, Red or Blue Network, or ABC or Mutual broadcasting system, much like TV was in the early 60s. All kinds of programs, dramas, Western variety, you name it. That's what radio was, theater of the mind. And a very effective theater of the mind that it was in its day. But then came Top 40 radio, middle of the road country, and what have you. And the real money for radio announcers was never in the smaller towns. It was always in the big markets. It was always going to be in the Pittsburghs, the Atlantas, the Los Angeles, the Dallas, Fort Worth, New York, maybe even a Rochester or a Syracuse, New York, a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, or Akron, Ohio. You might make a decent living, and you might be among the small percentage of radio announcers that really broke into the high tier of income. And that had been my goal, that I was spending my time to achieve, to be that radio announcer. I never got there. I never got to that level of being a famous Dick Biondi or one of those kind of radio announcers. I was nowhere near a Wolfman Jack or any of those from that time and that era. I worked my way up. I worked at a medium-sized station in Atlanta, Georgia for a while. I've worked at a number of stations on the air. And I will admit, it was a lot of fun in those early days to be on the air. But as I looked at the needs of my family and the insecurity that this particular job had, and the fact that you can burn out at a young age, the engineering started sounding a whole lot better. And I gravitated into that place. There are thousands of radio stations across the United States and Canada. A lot of them are small market. And they do the best they can in selling local advertising to local businesses. Even way back then, it was always hard to get the big chain stores to advertise, so little radio stations struggled to keep their head above water. And so the income structure for many radio announcers was really not that good. I can think of a whole lot of other jobs, even in fast food, that paid more than some of the radio announcers that I met. But they were in it with this high hope that someday I'm going to break through and I'm going to be that great radio announcer in some big city. And for way too many of them, it never happens. And they live life on the edge. More times than not, their marriages, I knew so many of them back in the day, in the 70s and into the 80s. They could never break into a decent-sized community and get a job on the air that actually paid a good living without having to work extra jobs. I mean, a lot of guys that I knew way back when as announcers took on literally some part-time jobs to make ends meet. It was sad. And that's why whenever I hear the song from Harry Chapin, WOLD, it reminds me of the negative side of some of the radio that we had back in the day. People that were burnt out, drank too much, smoked too much, had family issues, and never could seem to get ahead. And I think for many of those announcers, they couldn't recognize the fact they really didn't have the talent to be a major market radio announcer, but they kept holding on to this false hope that somehow, some way, something would change and some program director from San Diego or wherever would hear them and offer them this wonderful, high-paying job that never happened. And they wake up one day in their 40s, sometimes around 50, and they don't have a whole lot to show for their life. They've gone through a bad marriage in many cases, sometimes even to child support to pay, bill collectors at their heels. I've seen it. And by the grace of God, God pulled me away from being in that kind of environment, and I changed my career direction a couple of times in the 70s and 80s, and then again in the 90s, and made this shift to be all that I should be in this life. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Like I say, we're talking about time today. But I think of those radio announcers that I knew back in the 70s, even those that had started in the 50s and 60s, that burned out like a candle, ran out of steam. I've been to a few of their funerals over the years, and it's so sad. Radio can be a wonderful medium. I still love the radio business, in particular international shortwave, where I can talk to you, and now the new way of doing things in podcasting. I'm still a believer in local radio. But it's not an industry that I would want to marry anymore. I really wouldn't. Because the price that it can take of your time is too high. And we've been talking, like I say, about time today. There's a verse in the Bible, redeeming the time. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But to all those that have been in this business, that made the mistake of just holding on for a false hope, I present to you Harry Chapin and WOLD. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann.
Hello, honey, it's me. What did you think when you heard me back on the radio? What did the kids say when they knew it was their long-lost daddy-o? Remember how we listened to the radio, and I said that's the place to be. And how I got the job as an FM jock the day you married me. It was 2 kids and I was into AM rock, but I just had to run around. It's been 8 years since I left you, babe. Let me tell you about what's gone down. I am the morning DJ at WOLD, playing all the hits for you, wherever you may be. The bright good morning voice, who's heard but never seen, feeling all of 45, going on 15. The drinking I did on my last big gig, it made my voice go low. They said that they liked the young sound when they let me go. So I drifted on down to Tulsa, Oklahoma to do me a late night talk show. Now I've worked my way down home again near to Boise, Idaho. That's how this business goes. I am the morning DJ at WOLD, playing all the hits for you, wherever you may be. The bright good morning voice, who's heard but never seen, feeling all of 45, going on 15.
Yes, I'm a big-time guest MC. You should hear me talking to the little children and listen what they say to me. I got a spot on the top of my head, just begging for a new toupee. There's a fire around my gut from sitting on it, but it's never gonna go away. Sometimes I get this crazy dream that I just take off in my car. But you can travel on 10,000 miles and still stay where you are. Thinking that I should stop this jockeying and start that record store. Maybe I could settle down if you take me back once more. Okay, honey, I see. I guess he's better than me. Sure, old girl, I understand. You don't have to worry, I'm such a happy man. I am the morning DJ at WOLD. Playing all the hits for you, wherever you may be. With a bright good morning voice, who's heard but never seen. What did you say? Feeling all of 45, going on 15. I am the morning DJ at WOLD.
Harry Chapin's sad rendition of that song, WOLD. This is, by the way, your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. And I'm glad that you're taking time to listen to the program this weekend. Here we are. It's the first weekend in the month of February in the year of 2019. And it's hard to believe that we're about to wrap up the first 4 years of doing this program. Time, we've been talking about this today, time, how it can just fly by. Where did it go? Where did a year go? Where did 2 years go? 3, 5, 10, and even 20. That truism we learn from our parents and our grandparents, who probably have told us that as you get older, time will go a little bit faster. And you're not going to like it because it's going to seem that it just goes by too fast. You know, I was thinking, and I was sharing some thoughts a couple of weeks ago, and even last week, about the importance of family and restoring broken relationships. When my first wife died of cancer in 2004, hard to believe 15 years have gone by. 15 years are behind us now. And you lose track of some of the people because these daughters were technically steps, and things can happen that, you know, you end up... I just had a hard time staying where I had been at the time. I probably should have on one level, but, you know, I'm glad that I did on others. You know, you can't go back and redo, so you have what you have. And I'm very fortunate where I'm at today, and very blessed, I might add, too. But in the changes that I went through in those first years after losing her, I made some of the biggest mistakes that people do make after the loss of a spouse. Number one, never make any decisions too quickly. You need time, even though it's painful, to heal. Never try to delay or put off grief. Grief will have its time, no matter how far off you try to push that grief. I learned it. It's part of a dark time in my life, where life was not easy at all. And so, here we are today, 15 years later from her loss. And I was thinking the other day, I'm looking at some pictures of 15 and 20 years ago. And it seemed to me like only yesterday, where did the time go? Where did all the time go in these intervening years? I've got a picture of one of the grandkids. And I think I shared the story that we had gone to a 10th birthday party for a grandchild the day before my first wife collapsed, and I lost her. That's 15 years ago. That granddaughter now is 25. Where is the time gone? Where has the time gone? And what are we doing with this time that we have? How are we spending it? How are we investing our time? And yeah, there's truth in that term, investing our time. We can waste our time on a lot of things, and a lot of kids today, even in my day, we all did. We all wasted time because we thought time was a commodity that never ended. We thought it was a bank account that never could run dry, that there would always be time to spend on anything we wanted to spend it upon. And we'd hear people that were older than us say, you know, you're going to regret wasting your time. Thankfully, only a couple of times in my life did I waste my time in any kind of a job or occupation that I had. I consider myself among the most fortunate and among the most blessed to say that the majority of the work that I did in my lifetime was not really that much of a waste of time. Maybe some of my disc jockey days were a bit of a waste. They were fun, but they didn't accomplish much. There was some times in between a couple of jobs that I worked a few things that were short-term, very short-term, because I was always one to work and support my family. And I can look at my life and say, pretty much for the most part, I didn't waste a whole lot of time, and I'm thankful for the time that I've had on this earth. And we have no guarantee of how many days, months, years, or decades any of us will have. Even the most healthy among us may die at a time that seems so young. Maybe a tragic accident. You know, right now, and I wasn't really going to share this, I have a son-in-law who is facing the prospect of death from cancer at a young age. You know, I have buried 2 son-in-laws. And in one case, it's the hard life the one had chosen to live for a while that left so many serious health issues that even after he became thoroughly clean and got his life together, the damage had been done. And another that it doesn't make any sense. Why him? Life is not fair. It never has been. And that's why we shouldn't waste any of our time. We don't know how much time we have. You know, my late wife, prior to the cancer diagnosis in 2002, the later part of 2002, was in excellent health, looked far younger than her years, was looking forward to the next 5, 10, maybe 20, 25 years of life. At that point, why not? It is well within the realm of normal human life expectancy. She really thought that she would watch not only your kids get older, but the grandkids grow up. And that's what she wanted so desperately in life. That was her thing. Like a lot of grandmothers are. They want to be close to their grandchildren and watch them grow up too. Because there's a different relationship a grandparent has with a child versus a parent. And she so looked forward to watching the one who just will turn 25 later this year. Watch her grow up and even get married and start her own life and see even, great grandchildren. That was her goal. But it didn't happen. And here I am now, obviously, even though the age difference that we had was fairly substantial, I am now older than she was when she died. And I wonder, do I have 6 months, a year, a decade or more? I don't know. I'm learning the hard way to look at each day and do with that day what I can. I don't have the time to say, well, I'll do that 6 months from now, and just fiddle away the time in between when there are things that are important, things that are a family, things that need to be accomplished, things that shouldn't be procrastinated. I've got a friend of mine. He's in ministry. He's a little bit older than I am. He's a dear guy. I love him to death. But he's an absolute procrastinator, and his congregation of his church suffers because of it. When you procrastinate on things that are important, people do suffer, and you do have problems. Time is such a precious commodity. There are some things that do occupy our time. They have to, and it's just by the way the world works. I know when I lost my first wife, there was going to be a period of time that was going to be needed for grieving, whether I thought it was going to happen or not. I tried to put it off and try to move on, and guess what? Eventually, years later, it caught up, and I still went through the process. I'm glad I did. It put so much of who I am and the life that I have today into perspective, as it should. I look at the work that I have in radio, what things I can accomplish in terms of ministry, not so much money. There's no money in this radio show for me. Let me tell you that right now. I don't get paid to do this radio show, just so you know. If I ever made any money out of this radio show, I'd probably buy airtime on other radio stations to share this message. The point of this radio show is to help you through the journey of life. And I'm glad that so many of you do join me each and every week here on your weekend show. This is a labor of love. But today we are talking about the preciousness of time and how we shouldn't waste our time, misuse the time. I think of the years that I drifted away because of all the wrong things from the family that I've been a part of for so many years. And you don't do it intentionally, it just happens. And I've been spending a lot of time trying to restore those relationships, and it's wonderful that they're coming back together. Nobody ever stopped loving everybody. We just drifted away and then had to ask ourselves what happened. And you're almost afraid to take the first step to restore that relationship. And that's something that I'm doing right now. I'm redeeming that time. I'm trying to find the words to help you if you're going through something where time is being wasted. And I'm thinking of the way life used to be. I think we've made it a little bit more complicated. I think we've added too much stress to the lives that we have today that we should never have done. It's wonderful to have all this wonderful technology at our footsteps, at our fingertips. The cell phone, the computer, the big screen TV, 300 channels, connected dashboards. All these things are wonderful. The Internet of Things, I use them. I'm not some old codger that hates the Internet. I use it very much, but I'm trying my best not to be so dependent upon it that I cease being me. Yeah, I can check the temperature and set the heating and air conditioning system at our house in Georgia from our place in Florida. I have cameras. I can observe things at that site. There's plenty of alarm systems there. I can control lighting. It's the Internet of Things. Now, I'm still trying to figure out why you'd want to have a toaster connected to the Internet. I'm working on that one. Yeah, there is such a thing out there. I can see the benefit of certain things that are connected, which makes my life a little bit easier not to worry about everything when we're away from our place in Georgia. We can check in and make sure things are cared for, and I'd never have to worry. But sometimes being so connected in today's environment with jobs, you no longer go to work for somebody and get paid for the time that you put in, and then have time for your family, your friends, and your endeavors that identify you beyond your occupation. And those things are important. Your occupation is important, but there are other things that are important in life as well. And when we get so connected to our work, we fail in those other parts of our life, and we end up like that disc jockey from WOLD, with your personal life and your family collapsing around you. Has that been you in your life? Has it? Have you come to a place in life where it seems a lot of time was wasted? Time is a currency, but once it is spent, there is no refunds. You can never get it back. And it's a resource and a currency to which we do not know how much we have in our personal bank account. It's like we keep writing checks on that bank account, or we keep pulling out the debit or credit card and swipe it against the balance until the day it is declined or bounces, and then it's over. The Bible says, redeem the time. Make use of the time that we have on this earth. There's a time for everything, but there's really not time to waste. We sleep about a third of our lives. That's how we are made. We seem to work, once we hit a certain age, about 25% to a third of our life, depending on the occupation we're in, and some even more than that, who are so determined to be financially successful. And trust me, I have met people in my lifetime that if they could go back in time and make a few changes in their life, they would, if they could. But as I reminded you before, time is that commodity which once it is spent, it is gone, just like this hour for this radio show is gone. We'll be back again next week with another program. Don't forget the website, yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com. And until next week, may God richly bless you.